Hello, everyone, and welcome to this month's edition of the Seekers Forum. I hope you're having an excellent day. And let's say hello to Jay Cobley. How are you, Jay?
Hello, Mark. Doing good. It's good to be here with everyone.
Nice to see you. So, folks, for the next 15 minutes or so, I just invite you to sit back, relax, and I am going to give you the talk, and then we're going to go right into our first writing. So, this month, we are looking at the topic of the afterlife and what, if anything, actually survives the death of the physical body. Now, let me start out by saying that I have always been agnostic on this topic. I am open to the possibility, but I'm also maintain a healthy skepticism of certain kinds of accounts of the afterlife that have never quite rung true for me. Voltaire's take on it has always made the best sense. Voltaire said, "It is not more surprising to be born twice than once, since everything in nature is resurrection." Now, that makes sense to me. What Voltaire is saying, and which seems undeniable, is that while individual forms do disappear, the essential stuff of which they're made is recycled into new shapes, possibilities, and intentions. There is a growing body of evidence that some forms of afterlife do indeed exist, though the actual workings of this process are largely unknown to us. Now, of all of the traditions, Tibetan Buddhism probably comes closest to grasping the details of the process of death and dying and rebirth. The Tibetans call these stages bardos, which is the term for intermediate stages of consciousness. And they offer a kind of map to this mysterious process. The Tibetans have been honing this technology of consciousness for thousands of years, carefully mapping the 49-day journey that they believe completes the rebirth process. Now, this life cycle includes 6 bardos, according to the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying. The first 3 bardos, or stages of consciousness, involve birth and life, the dream state, and the meditative state. Those are different levels of consciousness that we move in and out of during the life cycle. The 4th bardo begins at the moment of death. This bardo commences when the outer and the inner breath are close and the death is very nearby. And that bardo continues until the external and the internal breath have been completed. The 5th bardo begins after the final inner breath. And this is when the luminosity of our true nature is said to commence. It's within this 5th bardo that visions and auditory phenomena occur. The 5th bardo also brings a welling up of profound peace and a pristine awareness of the unity of all things. However, people who have not done any spiritual practice are very unlikely to recognize this clear light at the moment of death, the Tibetans believe, and are usually deluded through this 5th bardo. And finally, there is a 6th bardo, and that's the bardo of becoming or transmigration. This is said to last until the in-breath commences in the new transmigrating form. So the actual nature of this rebirth is determined by what Tibetans call karmic seeds that they say exist within the storehouse consciousness. Tibetans use this system of reincarnation, as you probably know, to choose their Dalai Lama as well as their incarnations by presenting them with objects that belong to the deceased monk or whoever the person happens to be, and then putting them among groups, a large group of things that they are asked to choose among, also remembering their previous village, certain details of their past lives. Now, while the East has been developing this highly sophisticated system, we in the West, dominated as we are by scientific materialism, have been busy denying that any kind of an afterlife is possible, that the afterlife is anything more than a transparent, slightly pathetic attempt to dodge the fact of mortality. We see it as an imaginative device that we use to cope with the actual truth that the death of the body is the end of everything. This closed-mindedness, fortunately, has started to shift in the past 50 years or so. As a culture, we're beginning to take baby steps in the direction of considering rebirth, as well as the possibility of communication with energy fields of those who have dropped their bodies. Pioneering researchers like Ian Stevenson, as well as Jim Tucker of the University of Virginia, have collected thousands of case studies testifying to the veracity of such experiences. Ian Stevenson was a prominent psychologist at the University of Virginia who started collecting case studies of reincarnation in the 1970s. Many of these testimonies are uncanny enough to give even the most dubious among us pause. In one of the most famous cases, there was a toddler in Sri Lanka who overheard her mother mentioning the name of an obscure town that the girl had never been to. The girl then proceeded to inform her mother that she had drowned there when her dumb, quote unquote, brother pushed her in the river, that she had a bald father named Herath who sold flowers in a market near the Buddhist stupa, that she lived in a house that had a glass window in a roof, that there were dogs in the backyard that were tied up and fed meat, and that the house was next door to a big Hindu temple, outside of which people smashed coconuts on the ground. She gave all of these details to her parents. Stevenson was able to confirm that there was indeed a flower vendor in Kataragama who ran a stall near the Buddhist stupa, whose 2-year-old daughter had drowned in the river while the girl played with her mentally challenged brother. The man lived in a house where the neighbors threw meat to dogs tied up in their backyard, and it was adjacent to the main temple where devotees practice a religious ritual of smashing coconuts on the ground. In the end, 27 of the 30 idiosyncratic, verifiable statements that the girl made were proven to be facts. So this was one of Stevenson's approximately 3,000 such past life case reports that he collected from all over the world. Now, like a good scientist, Stevenson made exhaustive efforts to disconfirm the paranormal accounts that were coming to him. And yet, in the majority of these cases, he was able to identify an actual figure that once lived based solely on the statements given by the child. He began to practice the motto that the wish not to believe can influence as strongly as the wish to believe. It's very important. For those who wish to dismiss the afterlife and reincarnation as complete fantasies, there really is an awful lot of inexplicable material to contend with. And the same goes with communicating with the dead, which has also had a long checkered history in our culture. The Bible, of course, explicitly forbids attempts to communicate with the dead, which have always been associated with the dark arts. The Old Testament teaches that believers are defiled by their attempts at communicating with the dead, a practice that they say is detestable to God. The New Testament instructs believers to seek guidance from God and His Spirit only. The Bible further reveals that psychic experiences are real but demonic, and that deceiving spirits are counterfeits for the true Spirit of God. So this explains why people who have claimed to have experiences communicating with deceased loved ones, like this month's guest interview, Polly Case, have traditionally been deemed either deluded or crazy. Now, I can honestly say that that's what I was prepared to believe when Polly first told me her story. She said she had something to tell me, and I was prepared to disbelieve her. And yet, after listening to what she said with an open mind, I couldn't help but feel not only Polly's authenticity, but I was hard-pressed to find other explanations for the uncanny relationship that she's been able to maintain since the tragic death of her son, Shep. So I'm not going to paraphrase that story here. It's too good for that. I'd rather you hear it from Polly herself in our interview. But suffice it to say that she has been exiled from her family and she's lost many friends because of her experiences. She's borne the weight of her awareness, you could say, like Cassandra, who was doubted for her own prophecy and all that she was able to foresee. Polly's experience after her son's violent death also confirms the research of Ian Stevenson's protege, Jim Tucker. While Stevenson focused on cases in Asia, Tucker has mostly studied children in the US. And what he's found is that in about 70% of the cases of children claiming to remember past lives, the deceased died from an unnatural cause or a traumatic death, which suggests that this trauma or the shock of the death may, in some way that we don't understand, be linked to the purported survival of the self. Tucker further indicates that the time between death and apparent rebirth is on average 16 months, and that unusual birthmarks might match fatal wounds that were suffered by the deceased. Ian Stevenson also used birthmarks and physical defects as part of his identification regimen. Now, Tucker has developed what he calls the Strength of Case Scale, the SOCS, which evaluates what he sees as 4 aspects of potential cases of reincarnation. The first is whether it does involve birthmarks or defects that correspond to the supposed previous life. The second is the strength of the statements about the previous life. The third is the relevant behaviors in the present life that relate to the previous life. And finally, number 4 is an evaluation of the possibility of a connection between the child reporting a previous life and the supposed previous life. So he's using very strict criteria for making his determinations. Tucker actually suggests that quantum mechanics may offer a model by which memories and emotions could carry over from one life to another. Now, though we don't understand the mechanism of rebirth yet, even though the Tibetans have gone a long way, farther than anyone else, it does seem unlikely that all of these discoveries have no scientific basis to them whatsoever. The question that I want to explore with you today is, what does it have to do with how we live? If there is an afterlife realm where people, beings, consciousness, energy communicates across dimensional fields, does this in any way change our experience of being human, with its challenges, its questions, suffering, conflict, pain? I would suggest that, in fact, the answer is yes, for a number of reasons. First of all, a belief in the afterlife softens our materialistic terror of death as the ultimate negation, as a kind of mortal poof, an erasure, a nullifying of what we call our life. The next thing that a belief in the afterlife, or even better, a verification of the afterlife, might do is that we begin to see ourselves more porously, in a more quantum way, as waves and particles cohering in bodies that are actually mostly space, and seeing living and dying and regeneration as part of a continuum where we belong for eternity. Instead of death being a tossing out, an exile, a squashing, we have instead a feeling of connection at our core that has nothing to do with our personality or our biography, but in fact transcends both and isn't bound by our binary life versus death way of seeing. What this does is it helps us to view life and death more dialectically, as both and, rather than as a dichotomy of either or. Because when you look at nature carefully, it's obvious that matter is both living and dying, then disintegrating and then being repurposed. Okay, we see this cycle in nature all the time. Now, materialists believe in the false dichotomy that suggests that only what you can see, taste, touch, smell, or hear, or verify with machines can possibly be real. But of course, that is a very, very limited way of looking at things. A vision of rebirth offers a far more unifying orientation that connects us to the past and the future organically. And on this subject of unity, a belief in the continuation of consciousness in an afterlife would affect how we also approach some of the major problems that we're confronting in our age, such as climate change, for example. This is something that doesn't get talked about much, but I truly believe that part of the reason that we don't address the environment more urgently is that the people in power know that they won't personally be around to suffer the worst. Terrible as things are for the planet, many people in business, in government, including lobbyists, don't feel close enough to the danger themselves to feel the heat, so to speak, and make real change. But were we to shift to a paradigm of continuity, a paradigm of unity, and not be trapped in the idea that the physical body is everything, we might feel more of a stake in what happens 100 years from now. It could create a sense of emotional connection that might actually begin to heal this gap in caring. It would be part of a more general spiritual orientation that could help to end the selfishness and the tunnel blindness of the materialist, ego-centered worldview. Another benefit of being able to verify the existence of an afterlife would be its effect on the grieving process. Imagine if you were losing a loved one, but you knew that they were only continuing on, and that you might even be able to communicate with them after the death of the body. Imagine how that would ease the finality of disconnection. Overall, understanding that life goes on would open our minds to the part of ourselves that exists beyond space and time. And of course, science has come surprisingly close to confirming the existence of metaphysical connection and continuity. Discoveries in the field of quantum mechanics do line up with the mystic view that the invisible subatomic world is both unitary and in perpetual flux. You can see this insight echoed in theories such as Einstein's quantum entanglement, as well as his spooky action at a distance, which is a theory that suggests that the tiniest particles are linked to each other even if they're separated by long distance. So the irrational suggestion that distant forms, including human beings, are in communication with one another on the most subtle level is becoming common knowledge among physicists. And when it finally takes hold in our popular understanding, just imagine, the implications for how we live would be vast and potentially world-changing. Then people like Polly Case wouldn't face the kind of judgment and rejection that she's been forced to endure, which has only added to the grief over losing her son. And in fact, I have had one experience of communicating in some way with the dead, which I've never written about or shared in public. This happened over 30 years ago. I was asleep in my apartment in New York City, and I had a dream. Now, I'm someone who barely remembers my dreams, but in this one, which didn't feel like a dream, it had a different texture. I could see myself lying on the bed from outside my body and hearing a knock on the door. In the dream, I watched myself get up from the bed, cross the room, and open the door. And standing there was my dead sister, Marcia, next to a tall figure whose face I didn't actually look at. What happened then is that Marcia stepped forward. She put her hands on my shoulders. She brought her face close to mine, and she whispered, "I'm fine." 2 words, "I'm fine." When she pulled herself close, I could smell her perfume. I could feel her fingers gripping me, and I could feel her warm breath in my ear. At that very moment, I woke up, startled, and filled with this happy, warm feeling that then made me start to cry. Not out of sadness, but actually out of relief, because my sister had ended her own life when she was 29. And it was a terrible, painful, heartbreaking experience. But here she was so many years later, visiting me while I slept. It really felt like a visitation. I was fully aware. It felt completely real. Everything was happening in 3 dimensions. And when I woke up, there didn't seem to be the usual curtain of forgetfulness that falls between my own waking and dream states. Now, nothing like this has ever happened to me again, but it did give me a sign that I understood very, very little about consciousness, as if I didn't know that already. But this really drove it home. Whether it was Marcia's actual spirit at the door or her memory self emerging from some depth within me didn't really matter. The point was that I felt our connection in that moment, and it was enough. So that's what I wanted to say to you today about rebirth. And now, Jay, why don't we go right into our first writing? Okay, folks, I'd like you now, please, to take 15 minutes to write about your own beliefs about an afterlife. Okay, what do you believe about an afterlife? And how do these beliefs affect how you live? We're going to take 15 minutes to do that, and then we'll come back together as a group.